Good morning, ITC.
Good morning.
I'm Vanessa Lovelace, Assistant Professor of Hebrew Bible and Old Testament. My recent publication is an encyclopedia entry in the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Hebrew Bible and Gender Studies, titled Religious Leaders, Hebrew Bible. I examined the religious leaders or religious specialists in the Hebrew Bible who functioned as intermediaries between the worshiping community and its deity, and how those categories intersect with gender and sexuality, which is directly related to my research and teaching interests. Categories of religious leaders in the Hebrew Bible include priests, scribes, judges, and prophets. Religious leaders were both male and female, professional and lay. However, the preponderance of representation of religious leadership was male. This is in large part because the religious traditions represented as normative or orthodox in the Hebrew Bible represent the views of the male religious elites responsible for the text. Women are associated more with the popular religious traditions that the writers consider heterodox, such as necromancy and wizardry. It is these different locations of power constructed through sexuality and gender in the Hebrew Bible that was the subject of my encyclopedia entry. My research interest, as it relates to this publication, embodies, among other things, critical thinking as a category of significant learning here at the ITC. This is also, and I'm really glad to see a couple of my students here, poor Jokita and Patrick. They know the term intersectionality in and out through my teaching and integrating how we look at the text as it relates to both storytelling or story linking and critical thinking. Because they've come in, especially as new students in their first course, Intro to Hebrew Bible, and have one way of reading the text that they've been taught or has been passed down to them, and that is often reading from someone else's cultural context. Mm-hmm. And so now they're looking at the text, because I do contextual biblical studies. They're looking at these texts for the first time, not only through their own cultural context, but they are looking at it critically and asking, if all things being equal, then could priests be male and female? And so the first thing they see is that, okay, well, priests are male, but not every male gets to be priest. So gender is not just about male-female differences, but it's also about male-male, because every male can't be a priest. Only males from a certain family. Not only that, all males of that family can't be priests if they have defects, if they have any bodily deformities. And certainly even if you were a daughter in that family, you couldn't be priest. So beginning to ask how, if you take one category, priest, and you insert gender, then how is the text viewed differently, or how is that position viewed differently? And if you intersect sexuality, then how does it change? And so then looking at these texts from a more critical perspective of asking questions, of reflecting on those questions, of thinking outside the box, and then reevaluating it, and then starting again from the beginning, rereading those texts for the first time. And so what I have found is that, and I'll just use this as an example, when ITC students go to conferences such as the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, I consistently hear that the ITC students are of a whole nother level of thinking, because they have learned to think critically. And so that is very important for how we connect the story linking and critical thinking.
Excuse me while I go and get my remarks. Where you are right now should be full screen. Pull down to the next, there, full. And allow. And where were you? Back? Go back. Click one of those back arrows. Let me do it. There you go.
There you go.
Got it? There you go. Very good. Friends and colleagues, yes, please. I'm delighted to introduce you to the Fortress Commentary on the Bible, a 2-volume commentary. Along with Drs. David Sanchez and Cynthia Kittredge, I'm honored to be one of the editors and one of the contributors of the New Testament volume. Dr. Handy has asked us to link our work to the 4 areas of significant learning that comprise ITC's unique Sankofa model: story linking, community, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and critical thinking. So briefly, I will do so while describing the unique characteristics of these volumes. I think after being here for 14 years, you know enough of my biography that I don't need to go into it. For each of the commentaries in these 2 volumes, there are 3 layers. The first is the text in its ancient context. This is a work of story linking. It is an attempt to discover the story of the text itself within its own context, to understand the writer and the writing as something separate and apart from who we are. Until we can do that, we cannot fairly link its story to our own story, whether in agreement or in faithful critique. The second layer of this commentary is one that is often overlooked by biblical scholars, the layer of the history of interpretation. This is a work of community. For Christians who gather around the Lord's table, and for Africans conscious of being part of a larger group of persons in diaspora, both within the United States, within North America and South America more broadly, and throughout the entire world, we affirm that our community includes the ancestors, those who went before us. For biblical writings, that can mean the church mothers of ancient past, like Julian of Norwich. It can also include voices of more recent ancestors, including our own, who were enslaved during the Ma'afa. Understand, just because someone is in your community doesn't mean you agree with them. But you must know they are there and how their voices and their interpretations intersect with your own. For the third layer of this commentary, the writers focused on contemporary questions. Notice I did not say contemporary answers, but contemporary questions. This work, sometimes differentiated from exegesis and called hermeneutics, is a work of intrapersonal reflection. How does who we are today affect the way we read and interpret these texts to help create, and I quote, a liberating and transforming spirituality, close quote, within the church and the larger world? The thing I have loved most about this commentary is that its writers do not seek to answer questions, but to raise them. It is a commentary that we hope invites reflection and, Dr. Torre, synthesis. It invites you to make something new. Story linking community interpersonal reflection, both within the individual book commentaries like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and within the essays that accompany them, like my own essay on rootlessness and community in contexts of diaspora. These, we hope, lead those who use these commentaries to engage in critical thinking about these biblical texts, critical thinking about who has used these texts and for what purposes, good or ill, critical thinking about how to use these texts today. I'll give you just a quick example of that from the essay I wrote on rootlessness. I'm talking about migration and the way in which migrant rhetoric exists in the New Testament. And I say, as students of these texts, paying attention to these migrant strategies may help us to unpack some of the Christianity-related arguments in our civic communities, help us to figure out where we argue. Pay attention also to the sense of rootlessness that undergirds some of the music and culture, particularly of the United States. The sense that there's no place at home, but also we're not in Kansas anymore, that can emerge in the rhetoric even of people whose families have been resident since the days of European colonialism. For this is not simply a product of changing times. Times have always changed. In a culture so steeped in these migrant writings, this literary diaspora space called the New Testament, surely some of that rootlessness, some of those uncritically employed migrant strategies can be traced back to these ancient writings, these migrant scriptures of the Christian church. As editor of these volumes, I hope that both volumes will be an invitation into dialogue rather than a set of answers. For no commentary has all the answers. Let me say that again for those of you who are taking my exegesis class. No commentary has all the answers. But hopefully these commentaries can encourage students of Bible here and everywhere else to ask some very good questions. Thank you.
Great to be here with you and have you here. You know me, Mark Ellingson, but what you don't know about me maybe is I'm a cheerleader. Look at this group. We've got a faculty meeting up here, don't we? I went to Yale. I don't remember Yale getting 10 faculty members writing in 1 year. How about at Harvard, Dr. Mafico? How about at Union, Dr. Amer? 10 in 1 year? How about at Boston, Duke, huh? How come we don't, cheer for ourselves now, right? How come we don't get the word out? You know, I'm going to beg, we need to get some PR about this. And more frequently. I mean, we could have had the media out here. Next year when we have this many of us up here, let's get that out. Let's get the word out. Okay, enough cheerleading. Now, the author stuff. Well, you saw what I wrote about. Here's this white guy writing about Martin Luther, white theology. What does this have to do with ITC? Well, let's make sure we're telling the right stories here. Story linking. Who is this Martin Luther? Now, he's just another white guy who maybe started the Reformation, unless you know the whole story about how everything he learned from Augustine. How about some story linking here? And when you link stories like that, you got to be a critical thinker to see how the stories connect with each other. Now, the one article that I dealt with, so we're talking about story linking now, a little critical thinking. Let's talk about community, too. Shaving away our inequality. What Martin Luther said. It appeared in the Lutheran. Now, the Lutheran is the magazine of my denomination, the ELCA, which is the third largest Protestant body, has a circulation of close to 1 million. And so it's nice to have an audience like this for a brief piece like this. I know Ev Flanagan, our colleague at the Lutheran Center, said he was out in California, and there was some talk about this article, and I've been getting some fan mail and a little hate mail, too. What am I doing? Shaving away our inequality. Now, as Luther says, you know, sin is like a beard a man has. You can shave it, but it's always there. It's always popping up on you. And that's the way it works with government, too. It can look like a just law, but you got to keep shaving it or else it's going to come back. Now, some folks tell the story of Luther as he was a conservative, and there's some American white Lutherans who do that, too. But that's not the whole story, because, in fact, in this article, I talk about why Luther stood up against, didn't go with the peasants when they revolted. It had to do not with his economic agenda, but the fact that they thought they were bringing in the kingdom of God when they did this revolution. But in fact, Luther's whole life was devoted to the poor, to starting safety nets in towns, not just in churches, but in towns for the poor. Even the way he did his theology had the poor in mind. Let me tell you what he says about the seventh commandment. What does it mean? We are to fear and love God so that we don't take our neighbor's property or acquire them by dealing in shoddy wares. See, Luther was a skeptic of the free market, but help them improve and protect their property and income. And if you don't do that, you're breaking the seventh commandment. And that's what I always say to Lutheran students in the denominational courses. You know, if we got any poor folks, we're all sinners. This is the core of Luther's theology. Now, in terms of his views on the economy, you know, he believed in a managed economy. He wanted government to set prices. He believed in generous safety nets for the poor. And it ain't no accident, you know, that the Lutheran countries of Europe, they don't have poor folks, because if you're on welfare in Norway, if you're on welfare in Germany, you're in the middle class. Well, that's a story that needs to be told. And isn't this about community? Aren't these interests of the black church, of the black community too, this poverty? Is this an ally? So that's what I think Luther has to do maybe with ITC. community, story linking, and critical thinking. We got to tell the right story. Now, by the way, in terms of a big market, I'm really excited right now. I'm getting to write. The publisher who commissioned me to do these workbooks on preaching has got me writing a weekly column. It's called Lectionary Scripture Notes. Every week, you get it for free, because, see, the publisher's trying to sell you books when you get there, but it's for free. You can get my take on exegeting the text, the assigned text for the lectionary. So I'm into lectionary preaching too. And so if you need some exegesis, a little hint as to what to do with the text, look it up. It's right there in the address, and you get it for free. Now, colleagues in biblical studies, I'm not writing for SBL now. I'm writing for pastors. I think I'm okay, but I mean, I might not have every nuance there on that one. And finally, the last one. This is an article titled, and now it's clear we're talking about ITC, Luther and the Pre-Augustinian Fathers. It appeared in a volume called Ad Fontes Wittenbergensis. This was a document or a book, it's available on sale, produced by another branch of Lutheranism called the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. I'm proud to say that I was the only one from this liberal denomination, the ELCA that I belong to, that they allowed to speak at this conference where the text is. Now, partly that's because the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has a rich history of working with the African American community. For a long time, the majority of black Lutherans belong to that church. I'm proud for them, but sad to say for my own church, that's changing. At any rate, they put me on the program to tell another story. Not just that Luther got his ideas from Augustine, but Luther got his ideas from some other earlier African fathers. Now, we can call a roll. We can talk about Tertullian. We can talk about Origen. But we can even talk about some folks that, I don't know about Dr. Welchel, but I didn't know were African, like Fulgentius. Well, you can find out about them. You can find out about how Luther got his ideas on polity, on the sacraments, on Christology, and on the Trinity from these earlier African theologians. This is an invitation for interpreters of the Reformation, synthesis now, an interpretation for those who walk in the train of Luther to say, hey, connect these stories of Luther more to the ancient African church, and maybe there's still more to come as we make that our own. Thanks very much.
Would you be so kind as to hold me? Would you hold it? Thank you. Oh, he's going to hold it for me. I need some help. Absolutely. And I'm glad to have my colleague helping me. I've written the book on Sherman's March and the emergence of the independent black church movement from Atlanta to the sea to emancipation. And this was published by Pelgrave Macmillan. And I enjoyed writing this book and talking about this particular subject, this particular topic. The significant learnings, I guess, Dr. Toure, there are four that you have listed. Well, all four of them are embedded in what I have to say. I don't want to necessarily point them out because I think holistically, which is a part of Sankofa motif. So I just want to say a word. I just want to say a word about Sherman's March from Atlanta to Savannah. This year marks the 150th anniversary of Sherman's historic march. The battle between the Confederacy and the Union Army was one of the most decisive battles in the Civil War. By the time the Union Army reached Atlanta, the soldiers had been ordered to fight under scorched earth policy designed to break the will of the South to continue the fight. Sherman set fire to the buildings, and Atlanta went up in flames. The devastation was of biblical proportions. For miles around in every direction, homes, farms, businesses, churches, throughout Atlanta were burned to the ground. One of the unintended consequences of Sherman's march was the liberation of black churches, which had been appendages of white churches. Big Bethel in Atlanta was one of the churches liberated and spared from destruction. By the time Sherman and his army arrived in Savannah in December of 1864, the leaders in Savannah were aware of what had befallen Atlanta. The Confederate Army banished the city, and the mayor of the city of Savannah strolled down Bay Street with a big white sheet tied to a pole as he shouted, "Peace, peace, for God's sakes, peace." Immediately after Sherman's arrival in Savannah, the most amazing thing happened. 20 black religious leaders initiated a meeting with General Sherman to order their assistance and guidance in laying the groundwork for developing the institutional life of their own community. Without formal training or getting anybody's approval, except a call from the Lord, these black leaders had the courage and the concern of their community to answer the need for ethical leadership. These religious leaders realized that the freedom of black people without food, without clothing, and with no jobs left the lives of millions of them to be free, but free to starve to death. In Washington, D.C., President Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton were so intrigued to learn of the unexpected initiative by black community leaders that Stanton directed Sherman to arrange a meeting with the 20 black religious leaders. As a result of this historic meeting, the President of the United States issued Field Order Number 15. This order set aside the cities of Charleston, Beaufort, Hilton Head, Savannah, St. Augustine, Fernandina, Jacksonville, to be occupied and settled by blacks, and whites were expressly forbidden from settling on this land. Listen. This territory covered 400,000 acres of land, not just the 40 acres in the mule. For nearly 300 years, a black man could make a baby, but he could not be the father. A black woman could have a baby, but she could not be the mother. In addition to the land, the order provided provision for rebuilding strong black families by requiring the land to be allotted to respectable blacks, a head of household, to encourage two-family parents. It might have been providential that the Civil War basically ended in Savannah rather. It was the ideal place for newly freed blacks to lay the groundwork for implementing their freedom. The 20 black religious leaders consisted of 7 pastors, 8 assistant pastors, 5 laypersons. Their ages ranged from 26 to 72 years of age. 4 of the ministers had been in ministerial training for 20 years. Collectively, the 20 religious leaders had more than 270 years of experience in community development and leadership. The action of these 20 church leaders established the black church as the leader and the institutional womb of the black community. This is a model for leadership. And what I try to do with my students since I've been here these 10 years is to remind them that the church sometimes is so busy doing church work until it fails to do the work of the church. And the work of the church is in the community, serving the community. And this is a real model for community service and doing community work. As a pastor for 30 years, I was excited about the pastorate, particularly during the civil rights movement. And one reason I was so excited about the pastorate, because I enjoyed preaching on Sunday and picketing on Monday to bring about social change, to bring about social justice. And I think this is a model. And just suppose what would have happened if this plan had been implemented. The black family would be different. Our economics would be different if this had happened in terms of, with all of the meetings and all of the conventions that we have today. In my reading of history, the plan of these 20 black ministers that they proposed to Abraham Lincoln, it covers integration, it covers reparation, it covers the very thing that we need. And I think this is a model, and it certainly is a focus on the community and the development of the community. And this is one reason the African American church, sadly to say, is the strongest public institution in the African American community. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Is this on? Because I didn't know I was going to speak, I did not bring my publications, but I'm going to share some insights and my passion. Based on what I've learned from the Youth Hope Builders Academy, residential programs for 10 years, and 2 years in the Bridges Initiative, which is located in congregations in Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, Virginia, Michigan, a new one starting in Indiana, a new one starting in Louisiana, and a new one starting in Texas. But I also want to share significant learnings from students that I've taught over the years, and questions that continue to be raised about black youth. Let me share. In my article, which focuses on the role of worship in the lives of black youth, the question is raised, does worship meet the needs of black youth? If so, how does it, and what must yet be done? The emphasis on story linking of the church's role in connecting the stories of black youth with the story of God, and the stories of youth with the stories of our forebears, as an instructive mode for what they shall then do with their lives, happens in black worship. How so? Worship for black youth is an embodied experience if we allow it to be so. Or we might put it another way and say it is a performative experience if we let it be so. Because for youth today, the importance of being in the presence of God through their own movement, through their performances, through mime, liturgical dance, stepping, spoken word, all of those media are ways of characterizing their inner selves, and they're striving to connect with God through their stories. When I talked with one youth about what her liturgical dance meant to her, she simply said, I have to tell you, when I'm dancing, I'm really not present in the community. I feel myself almost out of the body and completely in the presence of God. And I know God is present in what I do. It was a positive, powerful statement that she was making. When we allow youth to embody worship through the expressive mode, through the performative mode, then we open the door for them to be in the presence of God in the way that speaks to them. But in the same way, it allows them to speak to us and for God to speak through them to us. And in churches where questions are raised, I simply say, shout it out. Let the youth be seen, let the youth be heard. Because another focus of youth today is they need and want to be seen as well as heard. The second part of worship in the lives of black youth has to do with its knowledge-giving part. Often we hear our youth say, I don't want to go to church because it's boring. But when we adopt the attitude that we must preach and speak with youth in mind, and speak and preach and talk about and exegete Scripture in the light of the stories that they live every day, they suddenly discover this is for me. So a shout out has to do with worship that speaks to them, that gives them knowledge on their level, which means giving knowledge that connects with the very lives they live every day. A third level, in terms of worship with black youth, has to do with how they are affirmed to the degree that they know that they know that they know that they know that they are valuable creations of God, and that their direction in life will be guided by God and will be guided by us as adults. On this, I want to go back and give a personal testimony, which I share with our young people and I share with our leaders, because I think sometimes we can't go back and bring forward some of the things that have been done in an earlier time. In the little church in which I grew up in Indiana, during the year, all of the young people who turned age 12 in that given year were called to the front. And as they came forward, their parent or parents came, and an elder member of the church came and met the pastor in the front. The liturgy was to lay hands on the youth and to pray for that youth, and then to prophesy, to tell what gifts were seen in the child. And they were based on observations that were made of that youth up to the time they were 12 years old. After the prophetic word of gifts of the child were named, then another prayer was given, and then the pastor would say, now we're going to establish places and activities in the church for you to further develop your gifts. Now, in my own experience at 12 years old, when I was called up, the prophecy was, you have two gifts. One, the gift of music. And I think they got that because at 5 years old, I was asked to play for the children's choir. And I was very, kind of bold in saying, well, you really ought to sing it this way. So, and you really ought to do it this way. So it's kind of bossy. So I think they might have gotten it out of that. But also the prophecy of teaching, you're going to be a teacher. And actually after that, they determined that I would play certain hymns for the congregation to sing during morning worship. And then I was farmed out to the adult Sunday school class, where Mr. Montgomery was the teacher. And he was an extraordinary teacher because he was very interactive in his pedagogy. And he allowed me not only to observe him, but he would also on occasion say, now you ask the questions to the adults. So it was in those ways that my gifts were cultivated. Can we not do more pedagogically to identify our youth gifts, to affirm them, and create opportunities out of the worship liturgy to make it happen? Now, my second article, which is called A Mandate for Action, the Church's Ministry with Urban Black Youth. I want you to get the article. I'm not going to say much about it, excepting that it has everything to do not just with story linking, but with community, with interpersonal, and critical thinking. Because it is no secret, as we wait for the information coming out of Ferguson, that our young people today are living texts of terror. And if we don't identify and act on ways to enter those living texts of terror, we literally forego the hope that there must be for today's youth and tomorrow's youth. The message must get out that all of these youth are our youth. There must not be congregations that continue to be silos with doors closed and with attitudes that those youth out there don't belong to us. The message must get out that the church is, in fact, a place without walls, and our responsibility lies within and without. And in order for that to happen, we must go outside the walls. We must make the connections. We must see the problems. We must